of a sore loser. But Trump's petulant reaction is due to something much deeper, much more flawed in his character. In her new book, Who Could Ever Love You?, Mary Trump details the dysfunctional upbringing that plagued her uncle and her entire family due to the patriarch, Fred Trump. As Mary Trump writes, the trouble with Donald had started long before he entered school. At home, he tormented his little brother, Robert, a year and a half younger, and seemed to have nothing but disdain for everybody else, including and perhaps his mother. The kids in the neighborhood alternately despised and feared him. He had a reputation for being a thin-skinned bully who beat up on younger kids, but ran home in a fit of rage as soon as somebody stood up to him. I spoke with Mary Trump earlier today to discuss if Trump's upbringing helps explain his unraveling at the debate. Watch. Mary, let's go ahead and begin with your uncle's debate performance. It's been psychoanalyzed by a lot of people, but out of all the things that could have triggered Donald Trump, people have zeroed in on this moment when the vice president, Kamala Harris, called his rallies boring and that people were leaving. And that really seemed to do the trick and get under his skin. He got flustered, claimed no one was going to her rallies, accused her of bussing people in or paying for people to go to her rallies, which we know is absolutely false. You know the man better than most people do, certainly more than we do. What about that moment made him snap in your judgment?
Yeah, I can't disagree. It was a seminal moment in the debate, but I think it's also fair to point out that the tone for the entire debate was set before anybody said a word, when clearly Donald wanted to hide behind his lectern, but Vice President Harris strode across the stage and shook hands with him, which was clearly something he did not want to do. So she put him on his back foot from the very beginning. The moment when she essentially mocked him for the debate, the rallies that he holds, and said they were boring and people leave early, inflicted a narcissistic injury from which, and I'm not overstating this, this is actually true, he will never recover. As we know, for a very long time now, Donald measures his sense of self-worth by how big things are. His fortune, his buildings, his crowds, etc. And she completely undermined that, because as much as he wants to delude himself, he has eyes. Like, he understands that his rallies don't draw as many people. He understands that people leave. So every other moment in the debate where he was flustered or lashing out was the result of that very first exchange.
Yeah, it's such an important point that you bring up. He lives on the adulation, and the fact that she can pop that bubble and say to him the truth that everybody else is seeing really just made him crumble like a house of cards. And there is another side to this, that Trump loves to fashion himself as a strong man. He praises dictators like Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un and Viktor Orban, as he did at the debate. But if there's one thing that supposed strongman leaders really suffer from, it is insecurity, and they don't like looking small. And ultimately, all of the things you described made him look small. No?
Yeah, and one of the great ironies here, and I think it's fair to point out, Hillary Clinton told us 8 years ago exactly who he was, that he was Putin's puppet, and that he was a man you could bait with a tweet, and you do not want to give him power. What Kamala Harris did was demonstrate those two things with Donald Trump's help. I mean, you know you're in trouble when you're saying that the leaders who, quote unquote, respect you are authoritarian strongmen like Orban and Putin. So she mocked that as well, because let's be real, if you want to be the leader of the free world, the last thing in the world you want other people to think of you is that you are admired by strongmen. The only way to be strong is to reject the strongman and to cut them down to size. So Vice President Harris did that beautifully, I thought.
Let's talk about your book for a moment and the kind of intersectionality with what we are discussing in the debate stage. You write about the negative impact Fred Trump left on your father, Fred Jr., who struggled with alcoholism and died at only the age of 42, unfortunately. You describe Fred Trump as a sociopath, and in the book, you recount how Donald told your father, who became a pilot instead of taking over the family business, and referred to him as a glorified bus driver. Talk to us more about this toxic impact that Fred Trump left on your family and Donald Trump specifically, you think?
Yeah, I'm really glad you pointed out that passage, because it has so much to do with how Donald became who he is. My dad was 8 years older. He was the namesake. He was the oldest son. He was supposed to take over the family empire. And my grandfather found him wanting for complicated and, quite frankly, unjust reasons. So my dad decided that his best course would be to strike out on his own. He became a professional pilot for TWA at the dawn of the jet age. And for those people who don't know what that means, pilots in the early 60s who were flying jets were considered rock stars. The only two people on the planet who felt that that was something to be ashamed of were my grandfather, Fred, and my uncle, Donald. And they mocked my father relentlessly for not just for becoming a pilot, but for turning his back on the family business. And I think that's when Donald started to realize how much power he could wield against people who were weaker than he was, with the support of somebody, in this case, my grandfather, who was much, much stronger.
When you see Donald Trump today engaging in what you're kind of describing, this cruel, abusive, bullying manner, the way he lies about marginalized communities, including now falsely saying that Haitian immigrants are eating pets, do you see that as the influence of his father, the result of trauma and the way that he wielded that power that you're talking about against your father, somebody who was weaker than him? And is there a connection between that?
There absolutely is. Donald grew up in a family without love. He also grew up in a family in which he saw what would happen to him if he went against my grandfather, if he was, in my grandfather's parlance, a loser. So Donald Trump molded himself to my grandfather's expectations, and he realized that bullying and being cruel were the things that were going to advance him in the family. Sadly, that also happens to be the case in America, in the Republican Party today. So we also had our family was also extraordinarily racist. So when Donald has an opportunity to go after the most vulnerable communities in our country, and he feels like that is going to redound to his benefit, he will do it. But I think it's also important to point out that he's not just doing this to score points. The situation in Springfield, Ohio is dire. He's engaging in stochastic terrorism. He's endangering the lives of men, women, and children who are doing nothing but trying to live the American dream. These are upstanding citizens. They're hardworking. And what's happening to them at Donald Trump's behest is a travesty, and it's yet one more thing that should disqualify him. So I think it's really important that you and others are covering this so extensively, because this alone should make it impossible for Donald Trump to be put back into the White House.
Mary, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and you always shed light on such an important connection between the personal experiences of Donald Trump and how that has shaped him into the way he conducts himself in public life. Thank you so much. Congratulations on the book, Who Could Ever Love You, by Mary Trump. Thank you, Mary. Good to see you.